3 years ago, I stood in a custom silk gown at the altar, surrounded by the elite of the shifter world, waiting for Thorne Blackwood to say, "I do." Instead, the most powerful alpha on the eastern seaboard looked at me, his jaw tight, his eyes dark, and whispered, "I can't." Then, he walked out. I didn't cry. I didn't chase him. I stripped off the white dress, put on a tailored suit, and built the Zenith Pack from the ground up, dominating the city's corporate real estate and shifter territories alike. I became the fierce, untouchable alpha he thought I couldn't be. I swore I would never let another man hold power over my heart, let alone my pack. But tonight, I made a reckless choice. Bored with the status quo, I finalized a hostile takeover of his territory's most prized downtown high-rise, intending to send a message. I expected a legal battle. I expected a proxy war. What I didn't expect was for Thorne Blackwood to bypass my security, walk straight into the center of my charity gala, and drop to his knees in front of 500 of my guests. Hey everyone, welcome back to Zoya's Collections. Before we get into tonight's story, I just want to take a second to say how much I love this community. Every day I get comments from listeners all over the world, and honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of doing this. So tonight, I want to hear from you. Wherever you're tuning in from, whether you're winding down after a long day, on your commute, or just settling in with this playing in the background, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this little community stretches, and I do read every single comment, so don't be shy. All right, let's get into it. Settle in, because this one's going to take you for a ride. Chapter 1. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The sudden silence in the grand ballroom of the Zenith Tower was deafening, broken only by the collective gasp of the city's elite. My heart slammed against my ribs, betraying the icy composure I projected. The scent hit me before my eyes could fully process his presence. Dark cedar, rain-soaked earth, and the undeniable, primal musk of an apex predator. It flooded my heightened senses, drowning out the expensive perfumes and colognes of my guests. My biological shifter instincts flared. The sudden, intense spike in my body heat, the desperate urge to bare my neck, instantly countered by my fierce, hard-won dominance. Thorne Blackwood was here. He looked bigger than I remembered. His broad shoulders stretched the seams of his charcoal suit, his presence commanding the room without him uttering a single word. He didn't carry the aggressive, territorial aura of an invading alpha. He carried the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute submission. He stayed on his knees, surrounded by the towering glass windows overlooking the city skyline. He didn't look at the hostile crowd. He looked only at me. A hostile takeover of the Blackwood financial building, Aurora? His voice was a deep, chest-rattling rumble that sent a biological tremor straight down my spine. You could have just called. I gripped the stem of my champagne glass, my knuckles turning white. My reckless acquisition earlier that afternoon was supposed to be a calculated business move, a way to assert dominance over the downtown district. It was supposed to force a negotiation through our lawyers. Instead, I had practically sent up a flare, and the beast had come directly to my door. "Security," I snapped, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the marble floors. "Remove Mr. Blackwood from the premises." Half a dozen of my largest enforcers stepped forward, their muscles tense, ready to physically eject the invading alpha. But Thorne didn't raise a fist. He didn't even shift his weight. "Tell them to stand down, Sarah," Thorne said, his voice entirely devoid of a challenge. "I'm not here to fight for the building. I'm not here to fight for the territory." He reached into his jacket. My enforcers growled, their biological instincts reacting to the perceived threat. But Thorne simply pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He placed it on the floor, sliding it across the polished marble until it stopped perfectly at the toe of my stiletto. "What is this?" I demanded, refusing to break eye contact. "The deed to the high-rise," he replied softly, "along with the controlling shares to every asset in my name. I didn't come to contest your takeover. I came to surrender the rest of it." The whispers in the room escalated into a frantic hum. Alpha Thorne Blackwood, the man who had publicly humiliated me 3 years ago, was handing over a billion-dollar empire in front of half the city. The power dynamic tilted wildly. I had engineered a corporate checkmate, expecting a war of attrition. Instead, he was handing me his crown. It felt wrong. It felt dangerously intimate. "I don't want your handouts, Thorne," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low octave. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was looking down at him. The heat radiating off his massive frame was magnetic, intoxicating. "I take what I want. I don't need you to give it to me." Thorne looked up at me, his golden eyes flashing with a raw, unprotected vulnerability that hit me harder than any physical blow. "You misunderstand," he murmured, his voice so low only my enhanced hearing could catch the raw desperation bleeding through his words. "I'm not just giving you the assets. I'm giving you me. Do whatever you want with the empire, but I am not leaving this city until you let me explain why I walked away." He leaned forward slightly, closing his eyes, completely exposing his throat to me, the ultimate biological submission from a wolf of his stature. "Take it all, Aurora," he whispered, the sound vibrating in the tense air between us. "But you're going to have to decide what to do with the alpha kneeling at your feet." Chapter 2. The silence in the grand ballroom wasn't just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating physical entity. 500 pairs of eyes darted between my rigid stance and the massive alpha kneeling on the polished marble. The erratic, spiking heartbeats of my elite guests formed a frantic, thrumming bassline in my ears. Underneath it all, I could hear the low, involuntary whimpers of the lesser wolves in the crowd. Men and women biologically overwhelmed by Thorne's sheer presence, their instincts warring between submitting to an invading apex predator and waiting for my command. He was offering me a billionaire's empire and his absolute submission, wrapping it all up in a violently intimate package right in the middle of my charity gala. Every primal instinct embedded deep in my DNA screamed at me to close the agonizing space between us. My body wanted to drop to the floor with him, to drag my hands through his dark hair, to inhale the rain-soaked cedar scent radiating from his massive frame, and to claim the mate I had been denied. I locked those treacherous instincts away in a steel box. I had not spent the last 3 years bleeding and clawing my way to the top of this city's corporate hierarchy to be undone by a dramatic gesture. I maintained my absolute, icy composure, despite the fact that my pulse was racing violently against my ribs. "Stand up, Thorne," I ordered. My voice was dangerously quiet, a velvet-wrapped blade that carried effortlessly to the furthest edges of the silent room. He didn't hesitate. The immense muscles in his back corded as he rose to his full height, instantly dwarfing my heavily armed enforcers. Even standing, his posture remained meticulously unthreatening. His broad shoulders were relaxed, his large hands open at his sides. He was deliberately broadcasting his vulnerability. He publicly surrendered his alpha aura to me, and the raw, unprotected devotion in his golden eyes made my breath catch in my throat, a biological glitch I ruthlessly suppressed. I turned sharply to my head of security. Marcus was practically vibrating out of his suit, his jaw clenched, his body aching with the urge to shift and attack. "Stand down, Marcus," I commanded, projecting my authority so firmly that Marcus physically flinched, his shoulders dropping in immediate obedience. "Escort our guests to the secondary lounge. The gala continues." I refused to make a scene and let the city's gossips watch me unravel. I spun on my heel, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing like gunshots against the pristine marble. "Bring the folder, Thorne. We are going to my office." I felt him follow me. His heavy, measured footsteps fell in perfect, terrifying sync with my own. We bypassed the murmuring sea of high society elites, slipping through the secure double doors that led to my private executive elevator. The moment the polished steel doors slid shut, sealing us inside the soundproofed space, the atmosphere instantly thickened to a dangerous density. The elevator shot upward to the penthouse level, but it felt as though the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the cabin. The overwhelming musk of his scent pressed against me from every side, wrapping around me like a physical touch. My core temperature spiked dramatically, an aggressive biological response demanding I bridge the tiny sliver of space between us. My enhanced hearing picked up the heavy thud of his heart. It was infuriatingly calm, deeply rhythmic, while my own pulse raced like a trapped bird battering against a cage. "You always did look breathtaking in crimson," Thorne murmured. His deep, gravelly voice vibrated in the small space, the low frequency doing devastating things to my nervous system. I snapped my gaze to his reflection in the mirrored doors, my eyes flashing with a sudden, defensive anger. "Do not flatter yourself into thinking we are having a romantic reunion, Thorne. You just handed me the deed to your most lucrative asset in front of the city's worst gossips. If this is some convoluted corporate strategy to destabilize my pack, it won't work. I am untethered to you." Thorne shifted slightly, turning his massive frame toward me. The subtle movement displaced the air, washing another wave of his heat over my skin. "There is no strategy, Sarah. No hidden agenda. I told you, I am surrendering it." "Nobody surrenders an empire," I shot back, my voice dripping with corporate cynicism as the elevator chimed, signaling our arrival at the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal my penthouse suite, a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering city skyline. I stepped out quickly, welcoming the rush of cool, aggressively filtered air, desperately needing the space to distance myself from the gravitational pull of his body. "They do," Thorne said softly, stepping out behind me and letting the heavy elevator doors lock shut with a definitive thud. When they realized the Empire was never the prize. Chapter 3. I walked straight to the center of the expansive office, deliberately placing the massive width of my custom mahogany desk between us. It was a physical barrier, a necessary corporate fortification against the intense, primal heat that rolled off him in continuous, distracting waves. The desk was my domain, a symbol of the untouchable power I had amassed in his absence. "Sit," I commanded, gesturing to one of the plush leather armchairs positioned opposite my desk. Thorne shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't need a seat, Aurora. I just need you to listen." He stayed exactly where he was, standing just inside the doorway. He was deliberately keeping his distance, visually proving he had no intention of crowding my space, challenging my authority, or acting as anything other than a guest in my territory. 3 years, I said, my voice dropping all its corporate polish, leaving only a cold, razor-sharp edge of pure resentment. "You walked out of our mating ceremony 3 years ago. No explanation, no warning. You just left me standing there, humiliated, in front of our combined packs, the elders, and the board of directors, and you vanished back into your territory. Now you break into my building and offer me your entire portfolio. Why?" Thorne's jaw clenched so hard I heard the faint grind of his teeth. The thick muscles in his neck jumped, and for a fraction of a second, the polished, controlled alpha facade cracked, revealing the raw, agonizing desperation bleeding underneath. "Because I realized I was going to destroy you," he said, the words tearing out of his throat like they had been clawing at him for years. I narrowed my eyes, crossing my arms tightly over my chest to keep my hands from trembling. "Excuse me?" "At the altar," he continued, taking a half-step forward before forcibly anchoring his large feet to the hardwood floor. "When I looked at you in that dress, my biological instincts didn't just recognize my mate, they recognized a queen." He held my gaze, forcing me to see the absolute reverence in his eyes. "I saw your brilliance, Sarah. I saw the ruthless ambition burning in your eyes, the absolute fire that was meant to conquer this city, this world." He dragged a heavy hand through his dark hair, the sharp, distinctive scent of his distress, burnt cedar and ozone, flooding the room. And then I looked at myself. I was a traditional, arrogant alpha, inheriting an archaic, patriarchal pack. Our laws would have forced you to walk a step behind me. Our elders would have suffocated your ambition in endless ceremonial duties. If I had completed that bond, I would have locked you in a cage built from my own legacy. I wasn't a king, I was just a boy with a title. My chest tightened, a sharp physical ache radiating outward from my ribs. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk until my knuckles turned white. I had spent 3 long years believing he found me lacking. I had built Zenith Pack out of pure, unadulterated spite, fueled by the agonizing rejection, determined to prove him wrong, to prove I was more than enough. "So you just abandoned me?" I whispered fiercely, the ice in my voice cracking to reveal the furious heat beneath. "I left to tear my own legacy to the ground," Thorne countered, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering devotion that rooted me to the spot. "I spent the last 3 years dismantling every outdated law in Blackwood territory. I ousted the conservative elders. I restructured our entire hierarchy, bringing our businesses into the modern century, building a progressive, unstoppable corporate empire. I didn't leave you, Aurora. I went to build a kingdom worthy of the woman you are." The absolute sincerity in his voice shook me to my absolute core. It wasn't a corporate game. It wasn't a trick. He had broken my heart to protect my potential, and then spent every waking moment of his life trying to earn the right to stand beside me again. "And now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The impenetrable walls of my emotional fortress were trembling violently, threatening to collapse under the weight of his breathtaking confession. Thorne dropped his gaze to the floor, his massive shoulders bowing slightly in profound submission. "Now, I am done. The kingdom is built. I brought it to you. But I know I lost the right to your heart that day. I couldn't stay away anymore. I'm starving for you, Sarah." I stared at the broken, devoted alpha standing in my office. A dangerous, intoxicating warmth spread rapidly through my veins. He wasn't demanding my forgiveness. He was utterly, helplessly at my mercy. "Words are cheap, Thorne," I said, my voice hardening, refusing to let him off the hook that easily. "A true queen isn't won with speeches." Chapter 4. Thorne's head snapped up, his golden eyes locking onto mine with blinding speed. The heavy sorrow in his expression instantly morphed into a burning, hyper-focused intensity. He didn't see my cold dismissal. He saw an opening. He saw a sliver of hope, and his predatory focus zeroed in on it with terrifying precision. "Name your terms," he said, his voice dropping a full octave, a primal vibration that rattled the heavy glass of my office windows. I slowly uncrossed my arms, leaning back against the edge of my desk, projecting absolute, untouchable authority. If he wanted to play this dangerous game, we were going to play it strictly by my rules. I held all the cards. I was in complete control. "You want to stay in my city? Fine," I said, my tone crisp, clinical, and uncompromising. "But you do not exist here as Alpha Blackwood. You will have no rank. You will have no authority over my pack, my board of directors, or my security personnel. In this tower, you are a subordinate. You are a guest on my territory, entirely subject to my command. If you step out of line, if you try to assert your biological dominance over a single one of my wolves, I will have you physically thrown onto the street." I paused, waiting for his pride to flare. I waited for the deep-seated, biological arrogance of an apex predator to reject the absolute humiliation of being publicly stripped of his rank and forced into submission. Instead, Thorne's massive chest heaved with a deep, shuddering breath of relief. A slow, devastatingly handsome smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, completely transforming the harsh lines of his face. "I am yours to command, Alpha," he murmured, the dominant title rolling off his tongue with a terrifying, eager reverence that made my pulse stutter. "Whatever you want, I accept." The complete absence of resistance unsettled me infinitely more than a physical fight would have. He wasn't fighting me for control. He was enthusiastically surrendering it completely, placing the entirety of our complex dynamic squarely on my shoulders. "My assistant will arrange a guest suite for you on the lower residential floors," I said, abruptly turning my back to him to hide the deep flush creeping up my neck. "Do not leave this floor until Marcus comes to collect you. We are done for tonight." I didn't wait for his response. I retreated immediately to my private living quarters attached to the office. locking the heavy steel door behind me with a loud, definitive click. Once alone, I stripped off my crimson blazer, my body running feverishly hot. The mate bond, which had laid dormant and bruised for 3 excruciating years, was suddenly wide awake and screaming for attention. Every nerve ending in my body felt electrified, humming with a violent, restless energy. I paced the length of my sprawling bedroom, trying desperately to shake the phantom sensation of his intense gaze on my skin, the echo of his deep voice vibrating in my chest. Hours passed, but sleep was a biological impossibility. The city lights cast long, distorted shadows across my hardwood floor, but all I could focus on was the suffocating, heavy scent of rain and cedar that had somehow seeped under the reinforced doorframe. It felt like he was in the room with me, a ghost of heat and dominance. Exhausted by the internal battle, I finally collapsed onto my massive bed, burying my face in the cool silk pillows, praying for physical exhaustion to override my feral instincts. Then, I heard it. Through the thick, soundproofed walls, my enhanced hearing picked up the distinct, heavy click of claws on hardwood. The sound of massive, weight-bearing floorboards groaning under an immense, unnatural presence. I froze, my breath catching painfully in the quiet room. The heavy footsteps moved slowly, deliberately down the private hallway, stopping directly outside my bedroom door. I heard a deep, resonant huff of air, followed by the heavy, settling thud of a massive body dropping onto the floor, completely blocking the exit. Thorne hadn't gone to the guest suite. He had shifted. The most feared alpha on the eastern seaboard was currently curled up on the hardwood floor, guarding my door like a devoted, obsessed sentinel. A profound, terrifying sense of safety washed over me, deeper and more potent than anything I had felt in 3 years. I closed my eyes, realizing with a sudden, breathless panic that by accepting his total submission, I had trapped myself in his absolute, relentless devotion. Chapter 5. The heavy oak door of my bedroom felt like the only barrier between my hard-won sanity and the intoxicating gravity of the alpha waiting on the other side. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, my enhanced hearing zeroed in on the slow, rhythmic breathing of the massive wolf curled in my hallway. It was an infuriatingly comforting sound, a primal biological lullaby that my body recognized and craved, even as my mind furiously rejected it. When morning finally broke, painting the city skyline in sharp shades of bruised purple and gold, I forced myself into my armor, a tailored crimson suit and a pair of ruthless stiletto heels. I was Aurora Cross, the apex predator of this city's corporate hierarchy. I did not cower in my own bedroom. I unlatched the heavy door and pulled it open, fully prepared to issue a verbal execution. Thorne was already standing. He had shifted back to his human form, dressed in a fresh, meticulously tailored navy suit that somehow made his broad shoulders look even more intimidating. The biological transition from wolf to human always required an immense, violent exertion of physical energy, the rapid expansion of muscle, the realignment of heavy bone, the sheer, burning body heat required to fuel the shift. The residual heat was still radiating off him in waves, warming the cool, filtered air of the corridor. The moment his golden eyes locked onto mine, that formidable, world-ending presence collapsed into soft, unwavering devotion. He dipped his head immediately, a smooth, deliberate exposure of his vulnerable neck. "Good morning, Alpha," his deep voice rumbled. The heavy vibration traveled through the hardwood floor and straight into the soles of my feet, sending a treacherous jolt of warmth up my legs. I tightened my grip on the brass door handle, fighting the immediate, biological spike in my core temperature. "My security team clears this floor at 7 o'clock, Thorne. I suggest you move to the guest wing before they find the billionaire CEO of Blackwood Financial sleeping in my corridor like a stray." A slow, breathtaking smile curved his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "They can find me wherever you command me to be, Sarah. But before you banish me to the other side of the penthouse, I brought you something." He reached into his jacket. My breath caught, every heightened instinct flaring defensively as he withdrew a heavy, ancient-looking wooden box, carved from dark ironwood. He didn't step forward to hand it to me. He stayed exactly where he was, flawlessly respecting the boundary of my personal space, forcing me to make the deliberate choice to close the distance. I stepped out of the doorway, the sharp, authoritative click of my heels echoing in the quiet hall. I stopped a breath away from him. The sheer physical heat of his massive frame was a tangible weight, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. "I told you I don't want your assets," I murmured, staring at the polished wood. "It's not an asset," Thorne replied softly. His gaze locked intensely on my mouth for a fraction of a second before dragging up to meet my eyes. "It's an anchor." He popped the silver clasp. Inside rested a rough-hewn piece of pure, midnight black obsidian. In the old days, before high-rises and corporate takeovers, an alpha would carry a stone from the absolute deepest, richest soil of their territory's earth, soaking it in the scent of their den. It was a biological tool, used strictly to ground a mate whose nervous system was running feverishly hot from an unconsummated bond. The scent hit me instantly. Crushed pine needles, rich rain-soaked earth, and the overwhelming, intoxicating musk of Thorne himself. My pupils dilated involuntarily, my mouth watering at the sheer, concentrated potency of it. "Take it," he whispered, his voice incredibly rough, raw with his own agonizing restraint. I reached into the box. As my fingertips brushed the coarse surface of the stone, the back of my knuckles grazed his warm skin. The biological reaction was catastrophic. The sheer friction of our skin touching sent a violent shockwave of raw, electrical static shooting up my arm. My nervous system short-circuited. The sudden, paralyzing wave of lethargic euphoria caused my knees to actually buckle. Before I could fall, Thorne dropped the box. It hit the floor with a heavy thud as his massive hands shot out, gripping my waist with a bruising, desperate strength to keep me upright. He hauled me flush against his chest, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. His heart was hammering against my ribs, wild and frantic, mimicking the chaotic rhythm of my own. We were frozen there in the hallway, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming sensory overload of our bodies finally touching after 3 agonizing years. "Sarah," he groaned, burying his face in the curve of my neck, his hot breath sending a violent shiver down my spine that demanded I surrender. Chapter 6. The excruciating friction of that morning's embrace haunted me through every board meeting, every conference call, and every ruthless negotiation I handled that day. My skin felt too tight, buzzing with a phantom electricity I couldn't shake. The hand-carved obsidian sat in the center of my desk, radiating a heavy scent that completely derailed my formidable focus, turning my sharp corporate mind into a hazy, primal mess of longing. By midnight, the penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. I stood in the center of my darkened living room, pouring a glass of expensive bourbon I didn't actually want. My biology was screaming at me, the unconsummated mate heat burning in my veins like a fever I couldn't break. The fierce, untouchable independence I had wrapped myself in for 3 years felt less like protective armor and more like a suffocating cage of my own making. Desperate for air, I slid open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the expansive, multi-level rooftop terrace. The city hummed 50 stories below, a chaotic sea of neon lights, sirens, and distant traffic. But up here, the air was sharp, cold, and refreshingly thin. I walked to the edge of the reinforced glass parapet, closing my eyes and letting the biting night wind cool the persistent flush on my neck and chest. Crunch. The distinct sound of a heavy paw stepping on the ornamental white gravel of my terrace garden snapped my eyes open. My enhanced hearing twitched, filtering out the distant city noise to focus on the deep, rhythmic panting emanating from the shadows of the manicured hedges. I turned slowly. Pacing through the modern water features was Thorne's wolf. He was an absolute monster of nature, a massive, pitch-black apex predator with shoulders broad enough to break a grown man in half. He was patrolling the perimeter of my terrace, his wet nose tilted to the wind, fiercely guarding a territory he didn't own simply because I was sleeping inside it. I set my crystal glass down on an iron patio table. The sharp clink of glass against metal echoed loudly in the quiet space. The great wolf stopped dead in its tracks, his intelligent, terrifyingly human golden eyes locked onto me across the expanse of the terrace. The air between us instantly thickened. The ambient noise of the city completely faded away, replaced by the heavy, syncopated rhythm of our racing heartbeats. I didn't retreat. And I stood my ground, my emerald silk robe billowing around my bare legs in the wind, holding the intense stare of the most dangerous creature in the city with unwavering dominance. Slowly, deliberately, the wolf bowed its massive head, dropping its front shoulders into a deep, utterly subservient stretch. Then, right there under the stark, unforgiving light of the moon, he shifted. The physical transition was a fluid, breathtaking display of brutal biological power. Muscle tore and rebuilt, heavy bones snapped and realigned, and intense steam rolled off his skin from the sheer caloric heat of the change. Within seconds, Thorne was standing exactly where the wolf had been. He was entirely bare-chested, his dark slacks hanging dangerously low on his narrow hips. The moonlight cascaded over him, casting harsh, dramatic shadows over the thick, corded muscles of his abdomen and the heavy, jagged scars that mapped his chest. He was breathing hard, his broad chest heaving rapidly. He looked wild, dangerous, and completely, hopelessly unhinged by desire. But he didn't take a single step toward me. Instead, Thorne stood absolutely motionless at the edge of the garden, his large hands clenching into trembling fists at his sides. He was actively fighting every primal instinct in his DNA that demanded he cross the terrace, pin me to the glass, and claim his mate. He was waiting for my permission. He was handing me the agonizing, intoxicating power of absolute control over his mind and body. Across the moonlit terrace, his golden eyes burned into mine. He tilted his head back, deliberately exposing the thick, vulnerable pulse point of his throat to the cold night air. "I am right here, Alpha," he rasped, his voice a raw, vibrating demand that carried effortlessly over the wind. "Whenever you are ready to break." Chapter 7. I didn't break that night on the terrace. I forced myself to turn away, retreating into the cold, sterile safety of my penthouse, while Thorne remained outside, standing guard in the freezing wind until dawn. But my ironclad resolve was fracturing, splintering under the sheer weight of his relentless devotion. The following evening, I stepped out of my private elevator into the penthouse suite, exhausted from a grueling 15-hour day of corporate warfare. I kicked off my stilettos, fully intending to collapse onto the sofa, when a rich, incredibly complex aroma drifted from the kitchen. My biological senses instantly flared. It wasn't the sterile, perfectly plated smell of the private chefs I usually hired. It was the deep, savory scent of slow-roasted venison, wild mountain rosemary, and caramelized root vegetables. It was the exact, highly specific scent of the traditional pack meals my late mother used to prepare when we lived in the Northern Territories, long before I had built my corporate empire. I walked quietly toward the state-of-the-art kitchen, the cool hardwood soothing my aching feet. Thorne was standing at the massive marble island, his broad back to me. He had discarded his suit jacket and rolled the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt up to his elbows, revealing thick, muscular forearms corded with prominent veins. He was moving with a surprising, meticulous grace, carefully tending to a heavy cast-iron skillet. He didn't turn around, but his broad shoulders relaxed. His enhanced hearing had undoubtedly tracked my heartbeat the moment the elevator doors opened. "You haven't eaten properly in 2 days, Sarah," he murmured, his deep voice carrying a gentle, domestic reprimand that made my chest tighten. "Your blood sugar is low. I can smell the cortisol from across the room." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms defensively, though the posture felt remarkably weak in the face of his care. "You broke into my private kitchen to play domestic?" "I didn't break in. Marcus let me in," Thorne corrected smoothly, finally turning to face me. He plated the food with quiet precision, setting a steaming bowl on the marble counter. And I'm not playing. Sit. The command wasn't an alpha order. It was a desperate, pleading request. I slowly uncrossed my arms and walked to the island, sliding onto one of the high leather bar stools. The moment I took a bite, an intense wave of pure nostalgia hit me so hard my eyes stung. It was perfect. It tasted exactly like safety. It tasted like the childhood I had buried under a mountain of ambition and spite. Thorne leaned his hips against the counter opposite me, watching me eat with an intensity that bordered on worship. "You remembered the recipe," I whispered, the vulnerability slipping past my defenses before I could stop it. "I remember everything about you, Aurora," he answered, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency. "I remember the way you used to trace the maps in the Pack archives. I remember that you hate the smell of lavender but love the scent of rain. I remember the exact look in your eyes 3 years ago, when I shattered your heart to pieces." I stopped chewing. The heavy silence in the kitchen pressed down on us. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't trying to justify the pain he had caused. He was dragging his own failure into the light and owning every agonizing second of it. "I was so angry," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "I spent 3 years hating you. I built this entire pack to prove you were a coward." Thorne nodded slowly, the golden hue of his eyes shining with profound sorrow. "I was a coward. But you used that anger to build an empire. You became exactly the queen I always knew you were." He slowly reached across the marble island, stopping an inch from my hand. He didn't grab me. He waited. I stared at his massive, scarred hand for a long moment, before slowly unclenching my fist, allowing my fingers to rest against the cool marble. Thorne let out a ragged breath. He gently covered my hand with his. His calloused palm was scorching hot, sending a frantic biological thrill racing up my arm. He lifted my hand to his mouth, never breaking eye contact, and pressed a devastatingly tender kiss to my knuckles. My pulse violently spiked. A heavy liquid heat pooled low in my stomach, the sheer, undeniable reality of our physical bond flooding my system. The walls of my fortress weren't just cracking anymore, they were completely turning to dust. Chapter 8. I snatched my hand back as if I had been burned. The sheer, overwhelming intensity of that single, tender kiss against my knuckles was too much. It bypassed my anger, bypassed my logic, and struck directly at the primal core of my biology. My lungs seized, and for a terrifying second, I forgot how to breathe. I didn't say a word. I turned on my heel and fled the kitchen, the sharp click of my bare feet against the hardwood echoing my chaotic retreat. I locked myself in my expansive home office, the heavy double doors sealing me in a sterile sanctuary of glass, steel, and towering stacks of corporate files. I threw myself into my leather executive chair and dragged the Blackwood financial merger documents toward me, desperate for the cold, unfeeling logic of numbers to extinguish the inferno raging in my blood. But my biology was in open revolt. An hour passed, and I hadn't processed a single paragraph. The unconsummated mate heat, suppressed for 3 agonizing years and violently triggered by Thorne's proximity, was mutating into a literal, physical fever. Sweat beaded at my hairline. My vision blurred at the edges, the printed words swimming on the page. My chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths as my core temperature spiked to dangerous, agonizing levels. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk, my knuckles turning white as a violent tremor shook my entire frame. I was losing control. The sensory overload was suffocating me. Aurora! I hadn't even heard the doors open. My enhanced hearing was completely drowned out by the frantic, deafening roar of my own pulse. Thorne was suddenly there, crossing the expanse of the office with terrifying speed. He bypassed the desk, ignoring the boundaries of my corporate fortress. He didn't ask for permission. He saw the biological crisis tearing me apart, and his apex predator instincts took absolute control. He stepped directly behind my chair, his massive hands gripping my trembling shoulders. "Breathe, Alpha," he ordered, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that penetrated the deafening static in my ears. "I can't," I choked out, my voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual authority. The heat was blinding. Thorne didn't hesitate. He pulled my chair back, hauling me up by my waist until I was on my feet, swaying dangerously. Before I could collapse, he stepped flush against my back. His massive, incredibly warm arms wrapped entirely around my waist, crossing over my stomach and pulling me flush against his broad chest. The physical grounding was instantaneous and catastrophic. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his deep, rhythmic breathing completely enveloping my panicked gasps. He was acting as a biological anchor, forcing my erratic nervous system to sync with his impossibly calm, steady strength. The sheer weight of him, the intoxicating scent of rain and dark cedar, and the overwhelming heat of his skin bleeding through the thin silk of my blouse acted like a physical sedative. Slowly, agonizingly, my violently shaking muscles began to relax. My lungs expanded, drawing in a long, desperate breath that tasted entirely of him. My chaotic heartbeat slowed, matching the heavy, methodical thud of his chest against my spine. We stood there in the dead silence of the office, pressed entirely flush against one another, completely at the mercy of the bond. Chapter 9. The fever broke, leaving behind a thick, heavy exhaustion and an agonizing, hyper-aware physical tension. I was completely enveloped in his strength, my back resting flush against his chest, his arms locked around my waist like a steel vice. I could feel every hard line of his body, the flex of his heavy thighs against the back of my legs, the rigid tension in his jaw as it rested against my collarbone. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the untouchable alpha of Zenith Pack. I was just a woman, exhausted and utterly dependent on the heat of her mate. "Better?" Thorne murmured. The deep vibration of his voice rumbled straight through my spine, sending a fresh, liquid heat pooling low in my stomach. "Yes," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet office. Slowly, reluctantly, his grip loosened just enough to allow me to turn around in his arms. I didn't step back. The biological magnetism between us was too strong, anchoring my feet to the floor. I looked up at him. His golden eyes were entirely dilated, dark with an unrestrained, feral desire that he was fighting with every ounce of his massive willpower. He was breathing heavily now, the physical toll of absorbing my biological panic reflecting in the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His absolute, uncompromising devotion stripped away the last of my defenses. He was the most dangerous predator in the city, and yet he was looking at me like I was the only oxygen in the room. Thorne swallowed hard. His gaze tracked the movement of my lips before dropping to the exposed line of my neck. He let out a ragged, desperate groan and tilted his head back, closing his eyes. He deliberately exposed his throat to me. It was the ultimate, biological act of submission. The thick, prominent pulse point beat frantically against his tanned skin. My shifter instincts flared with a violent, overwhelming demand to claim him, to sink my teeth into that exact spot and permanently mark him as mine, completing the bond right here on the floor of my office. My hand moved on its own. I reached up, my fingers trembling uncontrollably as they brushed the warm, heavily scarred skin of his neck. I traced the frantic rhythm of his pulse with my thumb. He shuddered violently at the contact, a low, desperate whine vibrating in the back of his throat, completely surrendering his control to my touch. I leaned in, my lips parting, as my fangs ached with the biological need to bite. The scent of his arousal and devotion was a physical drug, pulling me closer until I could feel the heat of his skin against my mouth. But the memory of the altar flashed in my mind, the utter devastation of losing control, of trusting someone with my absolute vulnerability. I gasped, snatching my hand back and taking a staggering step away from him. The sudden loss of his body heat was a physical blow. Thorne's eyes snapped open, blazing with a mixture of intense agony and profound understanding. "Not yet," I whispered fiercely, clutching my arms around my waist to hold myself together. Chapter 10. 3 days later, the tension between us had morphed into a suffocating physical weight. I had maintained my distance, retreating behind my corporate armor, but Thorne was a relentless, ever-present shadow of devotion. It culminated at the Zenith Pack's annual devotion exhibition. Hosted in the sprawling, state-of-the-art indoor training facility owned by my corporation, it was a brutal, modern-day pack tradition. It was how a contemporary corporate pack blew off steam and established physical hierarchy without resorting to actual territorial violence. Hundreds of my elite wolves filled the stadium seating, roaring as challengers engaged in heavy sparring and endurance trials on the padded arena floor. I sat in the elevated Alpha's box, maintaining my icy, untouchable composure, though my eyes never left the massive figure standing quietly at the edge of the arena. Thorne had stripped down to a tight, black athletic shirt and training pants. He wasn't there as an alpha, per my rules. He was there as a subordinate guest. But when the final trial was announced, a grueling, free-for-all physical gauntlet to claim a braided laurel wreath hanging 20 feet above the center mat, Thorne stepped onto the floor. The arena fell dead silent. My heart slammed against my ribs. He wasn't fighting for territory. He wasn't fighting for rank. The biological arrogance rolling off his massive frame made it abundantly clear he was fighting for an entirely different reason. The buzzer sounded. What followed wasn't a competition. It was an absolute, terrifying display of apex dominance. Thorne didn't use anger. He moved with a brutal, calculated precision, dismantling 3 of my largest, highest-ranking enforcers in under 60 seconds. He didn't severely injure them. He simply overpowered them with terrifying, effortless speed, proving the sheer, undisputed physical gap between a standard wolf and an alpha of his bloodline. Within 2 minutes, the remaining challengers backed away, exposing their throats in biological submission. Thorne leapt, his massive strength propelling him upward, and snatched the braided laurel wreath from the wire. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar. In tradition, the victor would present the wreath to an omega, or a chosen mate on the floor, claiming them publicly. Thorne landed heavily on the mat. He didn't look at the cheering crowd. He didn't look at the line of flushed, available omegas waiting by the sidelines. He turned his golden, predatory gaze directly up to my elevated box. He walked through the parted crowd, every eye in the arena tracking his massive form, until he stood directly beneath my balcony. The noise in the stadium rapidly died down to a hushed, electric whisper. Thorne looked up at me, his chest heaving, sweat gleaming on his heavily corded arms. He held the laurel wreath up, offering the symbol of absolute physical dominance exclusively to me. And then, in the dead, microphone-worthy silence of the arena, Thorne tilted his head back and let out a deep, chest-rattling purr. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated devotion, a biological claim that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into my core, explicitly telling 500 of my wolves that the most dangerous man in the room belonged entirely to their queen. Chapter 11. The deep, chest-rattling vibration of Thorne's purr faded, leaving a stunned, breathless silence in the Zenith Pack arena. 500 of my elite corporate wolves stared at the alpha box, then back down at the massive, lethal man on the mat who was publicly offering me his absolute physical devotion. I didn't break my icy facade, but beneath my tailored crimson blazer, my heart was battering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My lungs had entirely forgotten how to process oxygen. The sheer magnitude of his public submission was a biological tidal wave, washing away the last remaining bricks of my pride. I gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent, imperceptible acceptance of his victory. The stadium erupted into a deafening roar, but I didn't stay to bask in it. I stood, my stilettos clicking sharply as I exited the alpha box, flanked immediately by my security detail. By the time my armored SUV pulled up to the private underground loading dock of the arena, Thorne was already waiting. He had thrown a dark wool overcoat over his athletic gear, his chest still heaving slightly, his skin radiating that impossible, intoxicating heat. The drive back to the penthouse was agonizingly silent. We sat on opposite sides of the spacious leather back seat. The tinted windows isolated us from the chaotic blur of the city lights, leaving us trapped in a heavy, suffocating gravity. Every time I inhaled, the scent of crushed pine and rain-soaked earth completely overwhelmed my senses. I looked at him in the dim light of the street lamps passing by. He possessed the raw strength and the corporate assets to take this entire city by force, yet he sat with his massive hands resting open on his knees, deliberately unthreatening, waiting endlessly for my command. For 3 years, I had convinced myself that Zenith Pack was my fortress. I had built these corporate walls to protect myself from ever being humiliated, from ever being vulnerable to the devastating power of a mate. But as I watched his heavy jaw clench, actively fighting his own primal instincts just to give me space, the terrifying truth finally clicked. My fortress wasn't protecting me anymore. It was starving me. Thorne wasn't trying to conquer my walls or tear them down. He was perfectly content to sit outside them in the freezing rain for the rest of his natural life, just to prove his loyalty. The control I clung to wasn't a weapon anymore. It was merely a delay to my own inevitable happiness. We reached the penthouse in complete silence. I stepped out of the private elevator, my bare feet sinking into the plush hallway runner as I kicked off my heels. Thorne followed a few paces behind, stopping exactly where he always did, at the invisible boundary line in the corridor, preparing to shift and sleep on the hardwood floor outside my door to guard me. I walked to the heavy oak doors of my master suite. I wrapped my hand around the brass handle and pushed it open, revealing the sprawling, dimly lit sanctuary of my bedroom. I didn't step inside and lock him out. I turned around. Thorne was already unbuttoning his overcoat, preparing for the excruciatingly painful biological shift. "Thorne," I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of all its corporate authority, leaving only the raw, trembling truth beneath. He froze, his golden eyes snapping up to meet mine. I stepped backward, crossing the threshold into my bedroom, and left the heavy doors wide open. I didn't issue an alpha command. I issued an invitation. Come inside. Chapter 12. Thorne stopped breathing. The massive alpha stood paralyzed in the hallway, staring at the open doorway of my inner sanctum, as if I had just offered him the entire world. The air between us cracked with heavy electrical anticipation. Slowly, with an agonizingly deliberate reverence, he stepped over the threshold. The moment his large dress shoes met the plush carpet of my bedroom, the heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, locking with a definitive metallic click. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. The sudden, overwhelming reality of sharing this intensely private space with him instantly sucked all the oxygen from my lungs. His massive frame made my sprawling king-size suite feel dangerously small. I turned away, my pulse racing erratically, and walked to the edge of my bed. I didn't know what to do with my hands. The corporate predator who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar mergers was entirely gone, replaced by a hyper-aware, biologically desperate woman. Thorne didn't crowd me. He maintained a respectful distance, his golden eyes slowly taking in the room, the silk sheets, the towering city view from the floor-to-ceiling windows, the silver-backed vanity set on my dressing table. He was absorbing my scent, mapping the territory of the woman he loved. He walked slowly toward the vanity and picked up my heavy, silver-backed hairbrush. I watched his reflection in the mirrored glass. He turned toward me, his expression an intoxicating mixture of predatory focus and devastating tenderness. He didn't say a word. He just lifted the brush slightly, a silent, humble request. My breath hitched. I walked to the edge of the plush velvet bench at the foot of my bed and sat down, turning my back to him. I heard his heavy footsteps approach. The sheer heat of his body settled directly behind me, so close I could feel the microscopic hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, his massive hand gathered the heavy, dark weight of my hair. The contrast was enough to bring tears to my eyes. This was a man capable of snapping spines and tearing through heavily armed enforcers, yet his touch was impossibly, achingly delicate. He ran the brush through my hair with long, slow, hypnotic strokes. The bristles dragged gently against my scalp, sending a cascade of euphoric, biological shivers down my spine. "I have dreamed about this," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating right against my ear, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. "Every night, for 3 years, just this, just breathing the same air as you." He set the brush down on the bedside table. His large, calloused hands moved to my shoulders, his thumbs slowly tracing the tense line of my collarbone. The sheer physical intimacy of the gesture, the complete, unconditional worship radiating from his touch, shattered the very last fragment of my restraint. I couldn't take the slow, agonizing worship anymore. The unconsummated mate bond was a raging fire in my blood, demanding immediate, aggressive release. I stood up so fast the bench scraped against the floor. I spun around, completely abandoning my composure. I grabbed the lapels of his crisp dress shirt in both fists, using my shifter strength to haul his massive frame downward as I crashed my mouth against his. Chapter 13. The impact of our lips meeting was a complete biological detonation. 3 years of violently suppressed pheromones, bruised pride, and agonizing denied instincts exploded the second my mouth opened against his. A guttural, desperate groan ripped from the absolute bottom of Thorne's chest. His massive arms wrapped around me like steel cables, crushing me flush against his torso, completely obliterating any remaining space between us. It wasn't a gentle, tentative first kiss. It was a frantic, feral collision of teeth and heat, a desperate fight for oxygen. I tasted the salt of my own tears and the dark, rich flavor of his absolute devotion. My hands abandoned his lapels, dragging up into his thick, dark hair, gripping the strands tightly to anchor myself against the dizzying, euphoric rush flooding my nervous system. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the heavy crimson hue of the autumn lunar cycle crested the city skyline. It was the peak of the seasonal shifter cycle, a rare, biological alignment that triggered a massive, uncontrollable spike in apex pheromones. The crimson light flooded the bedroom, illuminating the sheer, untamed desperation of our bodies. The lunar trigger stripped away our civilized, corporate masks, leaving only the raw, undeniable imperative to mate. Thorne walked me backward, his mouth never leaving mine, until the back of my knees hit the edge of the mattress. We fell onto the silk sheets in a tangle of limbs. He hovered over me, taking all of his massive, crushing weight on his forearms, refusing to pin me down, refusing to take control, even when his biology was screaming at him to dominate. He broke the kiss, gasping for air. His golden eyes were blown wide, completely swallowed by his dilated obsidian pupils. The heavy, jagged scars across his chest heaved rapidly as he fought a terrifying, losing battle against his own predatory instincts. He was entirely at my mercy, his massive hands trembling violently where they gripped the silk sheets on either side of my head. "Sarah," he rasped, the sound tearing from his throat like sandpaper. "Tell me to stop. If you aren't ready, if you don't want this, tell me to stop right now, because my control is gone." He was handing me the reins, even at the absolute fever pitch of his biological desperation. He was proving, once and for all, that my autonomy meant more to him than his own sanity. I looked up at the man who had broken my heart to make me a queen. My blood was a raging inferno, every cell in my body demanding that I claim the alpha hovering above me. I reached up, tracing the hard, tense line of his jaw, completely consumed by my own fierce dominance and biological need. I took my crown. "Strip your armor," I commanded. Chapter 14. The command left my lips, echoing in the quiet expanse of the dimly lit master suite. For a fraction of a second, the sheer weight of what I had just demanded hung in the heavy, pheromone-laced air between us. I was demanding the ultimate biological surrender from a man whose very DNA was wired for absolute territorial dominance. Thorne didn't hesitate. He didn't fight the instinct. He embraced it with a terrifying, breathless eagerness. His massive hands moved to the top button of his crisp dress shirt. The fabric parted, revealing the thick, heavily corded muscles of his chest and the jagged, brutal scars that mapped his torso. Physical evidence of a lifetime spent fighting for his place at the absolute pinnacle of our hierarchy. But tonight, there was no fight in his golden eyes. There was only a profound, desperate worship. He stripped the shirt from his broad shoulders, letting the expensive fabric fall carelessly to the hardwood floor. The sheer caloric heat radiating off his bare skin hit me like a physical wave, spiking my own core temperature until I felt lightheaded. The scent of rain-soaked earth and rich cedar flooded the room, so concentrated and pure that it made my mouth water. He didn't stop. His large hands moved to his belt, unbuckling it with a sharp, metallic click that sent a violent shiver down my spine. Within seconds, he had shed the rest of his clothing, kicking the dark slacks and shoes aside. He stood before me entirely laid bare, a towering, heavily muscled apex predator, a billionaire CEO who commanded international corporate empires, completely exposed and agonizingly vulnerable under the crimson hue of the autumn lunar cycle. He took a slow, measured step toward the edge of the mattress where I sat. And then, the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard folded his massive frame downward, dropping to his knees on the plush carpet right at my feet. The traditional biological dynamics of our species fractured and shattered in that single, breathtaking movement. An alpha did not kneel. An alpha did not surrender his physical high ground. But Thorne was looking up at me from the floor, his golden eyes entirely blown out with desire, placing his neck perfectly level with my hands. "I am yours, Alpha," he rasped, his deep voice vibrating right into my marrow. "Do whatever you want with me." My breath hitched. I reached out, my hands trembling uncontrollably, as my fingertips finally made contact with the scorching heat of his bare shoulders. The biological friction of our skin touching sent an electrical shockwave of raw static straight up my arms. His entire massive frame shuddered violently under my touch, a low, desperate whine vibrating in the back of his throat. I traced the heavy slope of his collarbone, my nails lightly dragging against his skin. Every muscle in his body instantly locked, wound as tight as a coiled spring, entirely at the mercy of my movements. I wasn't just touching his skin, I was rewiring his nervous system, anchoring his frantic biology to my own unshakable dominance. I slid my hands up the thick column of his neck, burying my fingers in the dark, heavy silk of his hair. I tilted his head back, fully exposing the thick, vulnerable pulse point of his throat to the ambient light. His heart was hammering frantically against his arteries, a chaotic rhythm that perfectly mirrored the thumping in my own chest. "You left me at the altar to make me a queen," I whispered fiercely, my voice trembling with the sheer magnitude of the power he had handed me. I leaned forward, my face inches from his. "Now, you are going to show me exactly how a king submits." He swallowed hard, his golden eyes burning with an unrestrained, feral fire that begged for release, waiting entirely on my next command. Chapter 15. Thorne's heavy, ragged breathing was the only sound in the sprawling suite. I kept my fingers tangled firmly in his dark hair, maintaining the absolute physical control he so desperately craved. The intoxicating friction of our proximity was a biological drug, flooding my bloodstream with a chaotic cocktail of endorphins and apex pheromones. I didn't let him rise. Instead, I leaned down, bridging the final agonizing inches between us, and pressed my mouth to the searing heat of his exposed neck. Thorne let out a guttural, chest-rattling groan that vibrated against my lips. His massive hands shot out, gripping my hips with a bruising, desperate strength, anchoring himself as a violent shudder tore through his massive frame. I didn't bite. Not yet. I dragged my lips slowly up the thick column of his throat, savoring the frantic, erratic pulse thumping wildly beneath his skin. My biological heat surged, entirely syncing with his. "Sarah," he choked out, his voice a raw, sandpaper rasp. He buried his face in my stomach, wrapping his thick arms entirely around my waist. "Please, I'm burning alive. Look at me," I commanded softly. It took a monumental effort for him to fight through the biological haze, but his golden eyes slowly dragged up to meet mine. The absolute, unfiltered devotion shining in his gaze stripped away the very last layers of my corporate armor. He wasn't the arrogant boy who had walked away 3 years ago. He was a man who had systematically dismantled his own life just to build a pedestal worthy of my ambition. I stood up, forcing him to release my waist, and took a single step back. I shrugged out of my crimson blazer, letting it hit the floor. My silk blouse followed, then my skirt, until I stood before him exactly as he was, stripped of all the manufactured defenses we use to navigate the corporate world. Thorne stopped breathing completely. His eyes tracked every inch of my skin, absorbing me with a terrifying, predatory reverence. The heavy, dark scent of his cedar pheromones spiked aggressively in the room, mixing instantly with the sharp, rain-soaked ozone of my own scent. It was a flawless, biological chemical reaction, a molecular matching process that our bodies had been screaming for since the day we met. I stepped forward, swinging my leg over his massive thighs, and straddled his lap right there on the floor. The moment my bare skin settled entirely against his, a shockwave of euphoric, lethargic heat knocked the breath from both of our lungs. Thorne's massive hands immediately locked onto the back of my thighs, hauling me flush against his heavy chest. The contrast was breathtaking. The smooth, unblemished lines of my body pressed tightly against the brutal, battle-scarred landscape of his muscle. "You are the most magnificent creature I have ever seen," he whispered against my collarbone, his voice trembling with the weight of the confession. He trailed hot, desperate kisses up the side of my neck, his deep, rhythmic breathing completely enveloping my own. I spent 3 years tearing down my empire, terrified that I would never get the chance to worship yours. "You earned the right, Thorne," I breathed, wrapping my arms tightly around his broad shoulders. "You earned every piece of me." I threaded my fingers through his hair and pulled his head back, crashing my mouth against his in a bruising, deeply intimate kiss. The restraint shattered. Thorne's massive strength finally broke free, not to dominate, but to envelop. He swept me off the floor in one fluid, powerful motion, rising to his feet without ever breaking the kiss, and carried me toward the tangled silk sheets of the mattress, our bodies generating a feverish heat that threatened to burn the entire penthouse down. Chapter 16. The mattress bowed heavily under our combined weight as Thorne laid me back against the pillows. He followed me down instantly, taking his massive weight on his forearms, trapping me in a cage of scorching heat and heavily corded muscle. His golden eyes were entirely black now, swallowed by the feral, primal instinct of a mate on the absolute brink of completion. The biological imperative was deafening. Every cell in my body, every instinct embedded in my DNA, was screaming for the final, permanent claim. The friction of our skin was unbearable, a chaotic, searing electricity that demanded release. "Claim me," Thorne begged, the words tearing out of his throat in a raw, desperate growl. He dropped his head, burying his face in the crook of my neck, his broad chest heaving violently against my breasts. "Take it all, Aurora. Mark me. Make me yours." In the traditional hierarchy of our species, the alpha male always initiated the biological mark. He claimed the territory. He secured the bond. But tonight, under the heavy crimson light of the autumn lunar cycle, we were entirely rewriting the rules of our biology. I didn't hesitate. I wrapped my arms securely around his thick neck, holding his massive frame down against me. I turned my head, parting my lips against the junction of his shoulder and neck. My fangs ached, sharpening automatically in response to the massive surge of apex pheromones flooding the air between us. I opened my mouth, sinking my teeth deeply into the thick, heavily corded muscle of his shoulder. Thorne roared, a deep, chest-shattering sound of pure, unadulterated euphoria that rattled the reinforced glass of the penthouse windows. He arched his back violently, his massive hands gripping the headboard above my head until the solid wood groaned under the pressure. The biological mechanism of the bite triggered an instant, massive release of bonding endorphins. I tasted the rich, metallic heat of his blood, and in that exact second, a definitive chemical snap echoed through my nervous system. He belonged to me. The scent of rain and dark cedar was no longer just his. It was permanently, biologically woven into my own cellular structure. I slowly pulled back, soothing the mark with my tongue. Thorne was panting heavily, his massive frame shuddering with the overwhelming aftermath of the claim. He looked down at me, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire that completely stole my breath. "My queen," he rumbled, his voice dark and thick with devotion. He didn't wait for permission. He leaned down, his lips brushing the sensitive skin over my collarbone, exactly mirroring the placement of the mark I had just given him. He opened his mouth and sank his teeth into my shoulder. The pain was a sharp, brilliant flash, instantly completely consumed by a euphoric, mind-altering wave of biological heat. A heavy, settling shockwave of pure pheromones exploded outward from us, a molecular declaration of a completed bond that would undoubtedly be felt by every shifter in the immediate vicinity of the tower. My spine arched off the mattress, a breathless gasp tearing from my lips as the bond finalized, perfectly locking our nervous systems into a synchronized, unbreakable rhythm. Thorne pulled back, his chest heaving as he stared down at the permanent mark he had left on my skin. The frantic, feral energy instantly began to drain from his body, replaced by an impossibly heavy, sedated peace. He collapsed completely against me, burying his face in my chest, wrapping his massive arms around me in a fiercely protective hold, as the euphoric exhaustion of the biological claim dragged us both into the dark. Chapter 17. I woke to the soft, muted gray light of early dawn filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. For a long, disorienting moment, I didn't know why I couldn't move. A heavy, suffocating weight was pinned across my waist and chest, trapping me against the mattress. I blinked against the light, my senses slowly coming online. The first thing that hit me was the scent. It was completely altered. The sterile, cold ozone of my usual solitary environment was gone, entirely replaced by an incredibly rich, complex aroma. My biological scent of rain had permanently fused with the dark, heavy cedar of his pheromones. It smelled like safety. It smelled like absolute security. I tilted my head. Thorne was heavily asleep, his massive frame sprawled sideways across the bed. His face was buried in the curve of my neck, his hot, rhythmic breath fanning across my collarbone. One of his thick, heavily muscled legs was thrown protectively over mine, and his large arm was locked like an iron band across my stomach. Even in deep, exhausted sleep, his biology was fiercely guarding its newly claimed territory. I smiled, a soft, involuntary expression that felt completely foreign on my usually guarded features. I slowly lifted my hand, gently threading my fingers into the dark, messy silk of his hair. The subtle movement instantly pulled him from sleep. His enhanced hearing caught the shift in my heartbeat. His golden eyes fluttered open, blinking slowly against the dawn light. He didn't move away. He simply tightened his grip on my waist, pulling me even tighter against the solid heat of his chest. "Morning," he rasped, his morning voice an incredibly deep, gravelly vibration that sent a fresh wave of warmth pooling in my stomach. "You're crushing me, Thorne," I murmured, though I made absolutely no effort to push him off. He let out a low, rumbling chuckle, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the permanent mark on my collarbone. "I'm holding you, Sarah. There's a distinct biological difference." He shifted his massive weight slightly, taking the pressure off my ribs while maintaining the fiercely protective contact. "How do you feel?" "Like I could tear down a skyscraper with my bare hands," I admitted quietly. The biological feedback loop of a completed alpha bond had flooded my system with a terrifying amount of physical energy and mental clarity. My corporate armor felt entirely obsolete. I didn't need manufactured defenses anymore. I had a biological anchor that made me functionally untouchable. Thorne propped himself up on one massive elbow, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "You always could. You just didn't have anyone watching your back while you did it." He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw. The frantic, desperate edge of his devotion was gone, replaced by a calm, unbreakable certainty. The agonizing 3-year siege was over. "The board of directors is meeting at 9, I said, my voice dropping back into its familiar, authoritative cadence, though it lacked the icy edge it carried yesterday. "They are expecting me to announce the complete hostile assimilation of Blackwood Financial." Thorne smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips that made him look dangerously handsome. "And what are you going to announce instead?" "That Zenith Pack isn't assimilating anything," I replied, sitting up against the headboard, pulling the silk sheet over my chest. I looked at the massive, fiercely loyal apex predator sitting in my bed. "I'm going to announce that we are a unified corporate empire, and that the CEO of Blackwood Financial will be serving as my personal enforcer." Thorne didn't flinch at the demotion. He practically vibrated with eager reverence. He leaned forward, pressing a fiercely possessive kiss to my lips. "I'll wear my best suit, Alpha," he murmured against my mouth. "Let's go show this city exactly who it belongs to." Chapter 18. 3 months later, the corporate landscape of the eastern seaboard was entirely unrecognizable. The assimilation was complete. Zenith Blackwood wasn't just a unified pack anymore. It was an undisputed, monopolistic empire, and I sat at the absolute pinnacle of it. I sat at the head of the massive, 60-foot glass table in our newly constructed executive boardroom, watching the final remaining legacy elders from Thorne's former territory squirm in their ergonomic chairs. They were adjusting to the new world order, one where they answered exclusively to a fierce, untouchable queen. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to slam my fists on the table. I simply held their gaze with icy, unblinking authority. And if that wasn't enough to secure their absolute biological submission, the massive, lethal presence standing directly behind my right shoulder certainly was. Thorne wore a bespoke black suit, his broad shoulders blocking out the sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows behind us. To the rest of the world, he was a terrifying, massively powerful apex predator. He was my personal enforcer, a lethal shadow who commanded the physical hierarchy of the pack so I didn't have to. When one of the older board members raised his voice a fraction of a decibel too high in protest of a new progressive zoning policy, Thorne simply shifted his weight. A deep, chest-rattling rumble vibrated in the back of Thorne's throat. A heavy, biological warning that instantly spiked the cortisol levels in the room. The elder's face drained of color, his instinctual response forcing him to drop his gaze to the table in immediate submission. I didn't even look back. I simply raised 2 fingers, and Thorne instantly silenced the growl, stepping back into perfect, obedient alignment with my chair. "The policy passes," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. "We are adjourned." The executives practically tripped over themselves to exit the room, desperate to escape the suffocating, heavy pheromones of an apex enforcer actively guarding his mate. Within seconds, the sprawling boardroom was completely empty, leaving only the 2 of us. The heavy, imposing doors clicked shut. Instantly, the terrifying, predatory aura rolling off Thorne vanished, replaced entirely by a warm, intoxicating wave of rain-soaked cedar and absolute devotion. I stood up from my leather chair, a genuine soft smile breaking through my corporate armor. Before I could even turn around, Thorne's massive arms wrapped around my waist from behind, pulling my back flush against the solid, scorching heat of his chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his hot breath fanning over the permanent, healed mating mark on my collarbone. "You were terrifying today," I murmured, leaning back into his immense strength. "I am whatever you need me to be, Alpha," he rumbled, pressing a deep, lingering kiss against my pulse point. The biological feedback loop of our completed bond flooded my system with a rush of pure, euphoric endorphins, settling my tired muscles. We had 10 minutes before the winter solstice address. Thousands of our unified pack members were gathered in the plaza, 50 stories below, waiting for me to step out onto the executive balcony and formally usher in the new year. It was a ceremonial duty, but a vital one. I turned in his arms, stepping back to retrieve my heavy, crimson ceremonial overcoat that draped over the back of a nearby chair. As I slipped my arms into the sleeves, Thorne moved. He didn't hesitate. The most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard, the billionaire who had systematically conquered and then willingly dismantled his own legacy, stepped forward and dropped gracefully to one knee on the polished marble floor. He wasn't kneeling in surrender this time. He was kneeling in pure, unadulterated worship. His massive, calloused hands reached out, gently grasping the heavy velvet hem of my crimson coat. With painstaking, delicate reverence, he adjusted the fabric, ensuring it draped perfectly over my tailored suit, smoothing out invisible wrinkles with a touch so gentle it made my breath catch. I looked down at him, my heart swelling with a fierce, possessive love that completely overwhelmed my senses. I threaded my fingers through his dark hair, my nails lightly scratching his scalp, drawing a deep, vibrating purr from his chest. "They look at you out there like you're a monster, Thorne," I whispered, the quiet intimacy of the room wrapping around us. "They fear you." Thorne paused, his hands resting lightly against my calves. He tilted his head back, looking up at me with golden eyes that burned with a fierce, unwavering light. "Let them fear me, Aurora," he said, his deep voice thick with emotion. "Let them think I am a monster. Because it means they know there is absolutely nothing on this earth I wouldn't destroy to keep you safe." He slowly rose to his full, towering height, entirely eclipsing the sunlight in the room. He reached out, his scorching hands cupping my face, his thumbs gently tracing my cheekbones. The frantic, agonizing desperation of the past 3 years was entirely gone, replaced by a heavy, unbreakable certainty. "They used to call me a king," Thorne murmured, his words a sweeping, romantic vow spoken directly against my lips. "But I spent my whole life suffocating under a crown I never wanted. Building an empire was nothing. Conquering this city was nothing." He leaned his forehead against mine, our biological sense mingling into a perfect, flawless harmony. "The greatest power I have ever held, the only thing that has ever brought my soul peace, is the absolute privilege of being yours." He kissed me, a deep, slow, breathtaking confirmation of infinite devotion. When he finally pulled back, he offered me his arm, his golden eyes shining with nothing but pride. I looped my arm through his, my spine perfectly straight, my blood humming with the undeniable power of a fully realized queen. Together, we walked toward the heavy glass doors of the balcony, ready to step out and rule our empire.